Okay.
Okay, we're good to go. Is everyone ready?
Yep.
I'm going to start off with several points of refutation before going into the opposition case on why this is a terrible idea for the American public. So one of the things they first mention is that the government should not interfere in consumer choices. They say that the people have the right to make their own decisions, and the government shouldn't be restricting what belongs and doesn't belong on the market. There's an issue with this, being that this relates to people's health and can lead to loss of life due to a lack of information. This isn't just like, oh, which inflatable beach ball do I want to buy? This is which drug that relates to my health and the health of my family is on the countertops in pharmacies. And lots of times they say, oh, individuals should go out and do research for themselves. This isn't just basic research. This is highly advanced research and laboratories involving trials with extensive medical equipment that people can't simply do on their own. And lots of people don't have the time and the ability to go and spend hours and hours and hours digging to find whether a drug is effective or not. They should be able to trust the government and trust that what is on the shelf will help them out. That improves the lives of people as opposed to just guessing what's on the shelf and guessing whether it helps them out or not, or having to set up their own laboratory in their house to determine the effectiveness of drugs. You simply can't do that. You have to have some sort of outside institution with the infrastructure to test these drugs to be able to determine what is effective and what isn't, and therefore what should be allowed to be released to the public. And so that's why this whole situation of free market helps people out. On their side of the house, they want to improve the speediness of drugs getting to market. They want to improve the speediness of people's treatment. Well, if you want to do that, the way to do that is not to let people go and for themselves try a bunch of drugs and wait a few weeks to see if this one works. Oh, it doesn't. Let me go try this drug for a few weeks. That is very time-consuming right there. So trying to use the free market to weed out which ones are effective and ineffective is very lengthy in itself and doesn't help your point of trying to improve the speediness of treatment. Going into the our side of the house in our case. So the first main point here is there's a significant amount of harm done on the individuals and those struggling with health issues. The first harm is obviously financial harm. In this case, lots of times if a drug goes to the market and it's claimed to be able to solve cancer or to fix their medical issue, they will put a considerable amount of money into that drug because they have major issues going on. So, of course, they're going to be willing to sacrifice anything to get their hands on that if they read the claims and they believe those claims to be true. So when and we've seen before, that drugs can reach tens of thousands of dollars in costs annually. And so that's a considerable amount of money for people who may be struggling financially to have to put forward in order to gain access to these medications. And should they turn out to be ineffective, they just wasted a considerable amount of their own personal wealth to get a hold of this, and that leaves them in financial ruin. We shouldn't be letting people go into financial ruin for something that may or may not do what is put on the label. And then second is the mental devastation brought on by false hope and then despair. So if you tell people, if you put a drug on the counter, they'll say, hey, this is going to cure your pneumonia or something, or this is going to fix your chronic illness. They build up a lot of hope, and they're like, wow, this is great. My life is going to be significantly better, or my children's lives are going to be great. And then it doesn't work because it's ineffective and didn't go through government trials necessary. And then just despair comes after that. And it's just another mental blow to these people who have already been put down so much by their illness. And then another point of ours is that this is a system open to abuse. So the big pharma in this situation doesn't need to prove anything. What they can do and what they're allowed to do is essentially sell snake oil and make a shit ton of money off of it before anyone realizes that it doesn't actually do anything. Because if all you need to prove is that it doesn't harm you, then you could say, oh, this little jar of sugar water will cure your cancer, and then people will make a bunch of money off of it before it finds out that it's ineffective, and then in which case you could just leave with all the money you just made. And so ultimately this is a system just open to abuse, and you can't just say oh, the free market is going to solve us all out, because the effectiveness of drugs is something difficult to determine, and lots of times you can convince people with some sort of placebo effect that you are actually curing them when you're not. So these people, and lots of times, can't be able to determine the effectiveness immediately for themselves, and during this time, the big pharma is making a bunch of money in ways that is immoral. And then the other point here is during this time while we're waiting for trial, a lot of people are dying. They're saying, oh, look at all these people who are terminally ill, who could be getting this life-saving drug but aren't because they're waiting for these trials to go through. Well, lots of times, the majority of those times, those people on the verge of death are the ones involved in the trials. That's who the FDA uses to determine a lot of the effectiveness of these drugs. With cancer research, they use people who are terminally ill, and because of this, that's why they're great test subjects, because, I mean, like, it's kind of harsh, but if it doesn't work, they were going to die anyways. So that is why this doesn't really, their argument here doesn't have much of an impact, because the people who are going to die anyways, they are the ones involved in these trials. But as opposed to them just like getting these drugs in the free market by themselves in their own home and then seeing what happens or doesn't happen, they're doing this under the controlled circumstances of a laboratory where you can take data from it and learn lessons. So their whole point about like this gets people who are dying the drugs they need quicker. These people are already the ones involved in the clinical studies to determine whether the drugs are effective or not. So what we're just doing on our side of the house is making sure that they're taking those drugs under controlled circumstances where we can actually improve as a society from the results of that, and we can actually, like, with those lessons, get people the drugs that are actually effective, so when they go to a pharmacy, they can buy drugs knowing that those drugs are actually effective and have been proven effective by a trustworthy institution, which is the government in this case. So going back to it, we have proven that that the free market is a terrible determinant of what is effective for drugs, and the government should be involved in these choices because there is a serious harm if things go wrong. And also their point about people on the verge of death doesn't stand because they're the ones involved in these trials. And we have shown that there's a significant harm if this case were to go through financially and mentally, and this leaves a system open to abuse, and ultimately it's just another lack of regulations on big pharma that is a serious harm to our society, and for these reasons we are proud to oppose.
Honorable panel, opening opposition first claims that on side government there's going to be a loss of life due to a lack of health information like on our side of the house. But we think that this is a false statement because first of all, we think that they're pretending like on our side of the house there's still like that consumers are like or that are either going to be stupid or that they're not going to know what types of drugs they're purchasing. A couple responses to this. The first being that consumers are still able to consult with their doctors about what they think would be like the best step for them, right? So these consumers aren't necessarily purchasing these drugs by themselves. They're also purchasing these drugs with the help of their doctor. Secondly, we think that oh my gosh, okay, so, oh my god. So we think that so they can talk to their doctors about it, and we also think that the fact that we're talking often about like life-saving drugs and drugs that could potentially save lives, we think that lives are precious, and that when a consumer is buying a drug that's going to potentially help save their life, they're not just going to go willy-nilly into the store and be like, this drug looks good, and then take it off the shelf. They're going to put a lot of research and thought into it before they purchase any type of drug because they feel, or because they value their own life and want to save their life, so they're not just going to make some purchase willy-nilly without consulting, like the doctor or themselves. And no. Okay, and we also think that, then Van also talks about the speed of like the treatment itself, and he claims that on our side of the house it's going to end up longer because they're going to keep trying drug after drug. But we honestly think it's going to be a lengthier process to get to the correct treatment if the FDA or the EMA holds on to this drug for months or years in order to test it and make sure it's effective while someone is sitting here with cancer like, oh, I wonder if there's a drug that could save my life, but it's not on the market because the FDA and the EMA has been holding on to it for months and months and years, and this drug could be the potential that saves their life. Van responds to this point by saying that like the trials themselves are like that the ones that need the drugs are in the trials, but we tell you that often these trials take more time, that honestly if the consumer had access to the market and to more drugs on the market, that they'd end up being able to weed out the correct drug faster than if they're sitting here on a trial for months and months and months for a drug that might end up not being effective. And while they've been participating in this government trial this entire time for months and years, and then at the end they're like, oh yeah, that wasn't effective, then they die. And so honestly, like we think that on our side of the house, it ends up being more effective because because through the market and through the choices that they can make as well as alongside their doctors, we think that alongside the fact that like market turnovers can be very fast, and we think that pharmaceutical companies respond very much to the market and to what is purchased. And so if consumers are purchasing drugs and they're like, this isn't effective, they're not going to buy it anymore, and the pharmaceutical companies are going to be forced to create drugs that are effective because those are going to be the drugs that are actually going to sell. Okay, let's move on to yes. They also talk about how like they think that that government deciding the effectiveness and things like that is going to be better because but we honestly think that another example of how this wouldn't be good is if you take like the EpiPen example. So for example, when like people couldn't afford EpiPens often because like that was the only thing, like that was like the only drug that, or like not drug, sorry, the only like treatment that was like approved currently like by the government that was as both safe and effective, whereas and it was very, very expensive, and these consumers like couldn't afford their EpiPens. And the only way that consumers that can afford their EpiPens is that now is through like better options in the market, because like competition between the pharmaceutical companies and being able to create new products like the EpiPen was able to drive the price down so that citizens were actually able to afford these life-saving EpiPens. I'll take you.
The EpiPen is part of a government-sponsored monopoly, which is irrelevant in this case. There were other alternatives. This was just the government prohibiting those alternatives from going to the market due to like negotiations with corporations.
Okay, so we honestly think on your side of the house it could lead to a government monopoly on a lot of drugs, because if they're regulating both the safety and the effectiveness of the drugs and not letting the drugs go out onto the market until they approve these two things, they are in effect controlling the drugs that go out on the market, and they are in effect prohibiting these alternatives that could be saving people's lives. So I think that actually is an example that goes to our side of the house. Okay, like talking about their case, they also talk about, so they talked about financial harms on the individual, but honestly I think that it could end up being like a lot like financially more expensive for an individual to be participating in this very, very long trial run by the government as opposed to talking with their doctor and then making the purchase that they think is right for them. Like from the market, and we think that, like I already said, people value their lives. When they're making such a big financial decision, they're going to put a lot of thought and research into it. They're not just going to walk into the store and buy a random drug and be like, I think this is going to save my life. Okay. They also talk about how the system can be open to abuse because of pharmaceutical companies like making more money off of the system. But we honestly think that that citizens and consumers are going to be able to hold the pharmaceutical companies accountable when they put bad drugs on the market, right? Because it's not going to take very long for people to realize that the drug that they put out on the market wasn't effective, and they're able to have that market turnover, and then they won't buy the drug, and then pharmaceutical companies will come back with a more effective drug, and in this case, pharmaceutical companies will be selling drugs that are more effective, which is something that you'll honestly get better on our side of the house because you'll get to that drug faster. So what have we told you on opening government? So what have we told you on opening government that we want you to remember today? So the first thing being, so we told you that the two things that you need to remember here are the importance of speed and the importance of safety, which we think can go hand in hand, right? So we tell you that it's really important so we tell you that it's really important that we get these drugs out onto the market as fast as possible, because we could potentially be saving lives as we in order to get these drugs by skipping the effectiveness step in the regulatory process. And we think that, we also tell you that it's important for the safety and the health of the citizens, because when these consumers are making their own choices, they need to be able to make their own choices, and it shouldn't be up to the government to determine what drugs should be on the market and what should not be, because we think that goes too much into the interference into the market itself, and we don't think that's necessarily the place of the government. And it's for all these reasons that we proudly propose.
Really believe in people passionate about what you're saying.
That's such
Do you realize what you just said?
I should go.
The free of the market, the free of the people.
The free of the market, the free of the people. Honorable panel, side proposition come up here and then tell us how it is not up to the government to determine what people should consume and what they should or shouldn't buy. But let me remind side government that the people held always constantly the government responsible, accountable for everything that happens to them. They pay taxes, so they expect from the government safety, not only safety but also not financial harm and mental distress when they are going to be in a lot of debt and going to be less healthier and more poor. So on our side of the house, we say that this motion is asking the government to classify some things that may be water with sugar or macaroons as drugs, and then this is not acceptable in our side of the house, because we feel that the government has still a certain level of responsibility toward its citizens to inform them what they are consuming and if it's safe. Even if it's safe, we're not saying they should all completely ban those drugs from the market, but classify those drugs as drugs instead of food or what they are is actually harmful to the people, because we're giving them a false information or a partial information which cannot be harmful. And they come up with an argument about how consumers would be able to consult their doctors. How are doctors supposed to know which drugs are effective if we haven't tried them, if we haven't actually if we hadn't actually put them to the market? The drug sales would be as misinformed as the patient, and therefore the patient would be able to go from one drug to another until financial ruin and despair and mental illness, because we know that when people are poor, they are more likely to be in mental in stress and in stress and depression. And also we're going to go about how firms are going to get richer. No pharmaceutical firm is going to be willing to test effective drugs just because now they don't have to pass by the government, because now the government cannot hold them accountable for everything they have to do. So they'll just put those drugs in the market. They will just formulate something, and if it's safe, that's the only test they will have to do. They wouldn't have to pay a lot of people to try if those tests are actually effective. So people wouldn't actually be able to account them, and pharmaceutical companies are going to be more powerful, and they cannot hold them accountable more. And also, even if we admit that those products maybe are not food, are some kind of chemical composition that those patients can take that may possibly give them health in the future, we believe this is still harmful for them in that sense, because if they are trying different products at the same time, if you read your notice and your drugs notice, you know that some drugs cannot go to another, some chemical compounds cannot go to another. You cannot take them at the same time. But when you're trying to seek help, when you are desperate, you're going to be willing to take anything that's presented on this table. So you're going to be able to take a lot of different bunch of drugs that may be the composition and the mixing can be more harmful to them. On their side of the house, we're going to have a lot more dead bodies, more poor people, and no effect in the long run. I'll take you, Amanda.
Okay, when your life is in danger and you need to make sure that you get a life-saving drug, are you really going to just grab any drug off the table, or are you going to actually be heightened and more aware about the choices that you're making as a consumer?
Exactly. You're going to be able to you're going to take more drugs on the table because you're desperate. I mean, if someone is in despair, this person is going to take anything, and I do really believe that person is going to take anything presented on them on the table. They're not going to be informed choices. If you're in desperation, you're not able to make informed choices. That sounds good. So government also will have our second main argument, which is how it undermines science, right? When you allow firms and pharmaceutical companies to just put out everything they want in the society and in the market, researchers, scientists who spend years researching for cancer, who spend years researching for cures for malaria or pneumonia or all of these are going to be undermined because people are not going to be listening to them. People are going to be impatient. They want something quick and something now. And if we're enabling them to have something quick and something now, those scientists will not have any willingness, any motive to keep researching for those effectiveness, because at the end of the day, they're not going to have the return of the years and the money they invested in that. And also people are not going to believe them because people are saying, oh, I'm already taking this drug. It might be effective. I might die by the time they're going to discover the actual effective drug. So I believe this is going to undermine science to a greater extent. Less scientists are going to engage in research. Less scientists are going to engage in having more drugs that are actually effective and help make a healthier society, a better society in the future. So I'm going to go to some point of rebuttal that they made, and they talk about how trials are going to take years. And we believe that we're still able to take this burden, right? Because even if we admit that we put those drugs in the market, and they are safe but not not dangerous but not effective, those also before the patients are going to recognize that this is not actually effective, it also takes years. So we're going to come back to square zero, but just the patient being more poorer, the patient not being able to have this financial thing to actually pay the more effective drug. So we believe that on our side of the house, even if at the end of the day, that's going to be mean, even if at the end of the day, those patients are going to die if they're not more effective. We believe that they're not going to die poor. So we believe that at the end of the day, they're going to have we'll have more significant impact in our side of the house. So let's go back. Because we hold pharmaceutical companies accountable, the people want a government that actually protect them, provide them safety, that actually would not let them in financial ruin. And a government that believes in science, that wants the scientists to thrive, that wants the scientists to actually produce more effective drugs, I beg you to oppose this motion.
Honorable Speaker, we think that opposition needs to engage with the reality of the situation, which is that large pharmaceutical companies aren't producing the most effective drugs. They have massive profit incentives that make it so they produce products that will get the most amount of money possible. This means they produce drugs that people will have to take for a long period of time over the course of their life. They produce drugs that will get people hooked, like oxycodone, or like many antidepressants and anti-anxiety drugs that may not be as effective as they claim, and instead are designed to just get the most amount of money possible from citizens. We think that still testing for safety means you're still going to get the benefits of making sure that drugs don't interact in harmful ways and making sure that citizens are safe, but it's going to remove the harmful profit incentives and switch the onus from being able to sue the FDA when a drug isn't effective, and instead having the actor responsible, instead of the individual as opening government gives you, be on doctors and hospitals, so that doctors and hospitals are forced to take their patients more seriously and also forced to do increased research to make sure that the products that they're prescribing are actually positively impacting their patients. So, those are my two main points of extension. So starting with a little bit of rebuttal, I think we're still going to get the safety because like we're literally still testing to see if drugs are safe. We're going to test how they interact. And we're also fine like with having this be like a Canadian or European healthcare system where we're not going to put like tens of thousands of dollars on individuals, although we think that the debate works fine in either system to take out a little bit from opening opposition. But we also think that like this isn't going to like make firms get richer because they're not testing, because there's still a market incentive to make sure that your drugs are effective. Hospitals aren't going to want to use them if they aren't. Okay, no. Okay, so how do we think incentives work right now? Right now, if you get medical care that isn't helpful to you, you're able to sue the doctor or the hospital. It's really difficult to sue the company that's producing the drugs that you've created or get any kind of recourse for that. Why is that the case? It's because the government has like signed off on saying that these drugs are effective. The problem is, as the opening pointed out, this can often take a lot of time. But second to that, the studies are often not very accurate at all because pharmaceutical companies want their drug to be passed and to be included in the market as quickly as possible. So what they do is they do maybe like 60 studies where they pay researchers to do the studies, so the researchers have an incentive to try to like find a positive result for the company, or else they won't be asked to do a study for a pharmaceutical company ever again. And then they don't report the studies that find results that are bad for them. So they only report the few studies that find positive results. This means you're not actually getting beneficial medications on opposite side of the house. When we remove this structure, what it means is that it's no longer pharmaceutical companies who have a monopoly on doing this research. Now instead, you have other actors like hospitals and like pharmacies who have an incentive to like do their own studies, and it means that more government funding will probably go to independent universities to do independent studies to see if these results are valid. It also means pharmaceutical companies have less of an incentive to literally bribe doctors in order to get the results that they want and in order for those medications to be prescribed. Like pharmaceutical companies routinely take doctors out for 5-star dinners or like provide free or low price medications so that they get in the habit of prescribing those medications because all they want is to sell as much as possible, even if it's not actually helping people, which we think is like really harmful. So now for hospitals and doctors, the profit incentive is flipped, right? Because now they no longer have an incentive to take these bribes from big pharmaceutical companies and to like not engage in any kind of innovation themselves, because now they can be sued by like their own clients, and also like doctors can be held responsible if drugs aren't effective, which means that now they're going to focus on doing their own types of research. So what do we think that's going to look like? We think it'll happen on 3 different levels. First, it'll happen on the level of the doctors. We think right now in the status quo, doctors often don't take their own patients seriously and they don't follow up after they're prescribing medication. You're told by the FDA that this drug is effective, therefore you prescribe it as much as possible because pharmaceutical companies give you a financial incentive to do so, because often like doctors get cutbacks based on how much of a medication they prescribe, or they get like more benefits from the pharmaceutical companies, like more 5-star dinners, which people seem to be quite into. But we also think that they're going to take their patients more seriously because they want to find out if the medication is effective. So what that means is that when you go to a doctor and they prescribe you medication, they'll call and follow up and see if what they prescribed worked. Right now, we don't know how many people actually take the medication they're prescribed. We don't know whether or not it worked for them. And we also don't have information about how it works for the large variety of people who exist in society who often aren't tested upon when pharmaceutical companies are testing these drugs. So we think that it's more likely for doctors to care. But also there's more onus on the doctors to do this research because they can be held responsible if the drugs aren't effective, versus in the status quo where they can just blame it all on the FDA saying that it was effective and blame it on like these flawed studies that occur that they know are flawed but prescribe the drugs anyways. Sure.
Okay, so doctors will do their own studies so that they don't want to get sued. So the doctors will put a bunch of money, which will fall on the consumers, to determine whether it's effective or not, and that will take the same amount of time as an FDA study. How does this save time?
Okay, so we're not arguing that this saves time. We're arguing that this creates better medications and that people get better treatment. You're talking about opening government. Okay, so second, how does this work on the hospital level? We think hospitals have a huge budget, and that like right now they're very afraid of like lawsuits, right? Like because people sue all the time if they don't get the medical care that they need. So we think that like they have an incentive to make sure that the drugs that they're prescribing, that they're using, are beneficial. First, we think individuals can choose what hospital they go to. Like in a Western Liverpool and Oxford, you have choice. You want to go to the one that's going to prescribe you medications that work. So they're going to want to test these, but also because they want to be careful about lawsuits and make sure that they're giving like the best possible medication that they can in order to get the best results. But we also think that this occurs on an individual level where people take their own experiences more seriously. Because right now, like when pharmaceutical companies test these products, they test it primarily on like white men, because that's the people who volunteer for the studies, or the identity of the people who engage in the studies, and very little research and very little money is put into like women's healthcare or understanding how drugs impact people of different varieties. We also think that there isn't an incentive for research to continue after the initial FDA study has been approved, because pharmaceutical companies don't want to have it find out that their drug was ineffective. What we think changes is now people take their own experiences more seriously and are more willing to tell doctors, hey, this drug isn't actually working for me. I need to try something different. The doctor can't just say, oh, it should work because the government says that it does. Instead, they have to look into it and see if this actually happens. Right now, we have like a 7-year gap between research being done and it filtering down to your average doctor. We think that will be closed when doctors are now actively trying to improve their education and trying to have more connection with their patients to understand how things are happening. We think that we don't need to be having like hospitals conducting large-scale studies in order to get benefit. Instead, we have doctors having a more personal relationship with their patients, following up with their patients, and seeing how this works, recording it on a large scale. I have like 2 more seconds left, guys. Thank you, and Project Pros.
CO so badly.
Yeah, that.
Yeah.
Whoever's the first speaker on CO.
Yeah.
Okay, closing up. Yeah, closing up.
Hey, can I use this thing?
Yeah, go for it.
Sure.
As long as you don't block the camera, it looks like the audio.
I'll just
Speaker, when there are communities in society that have been socially and economically marginalized for decades and centuries, it must be recognized that we have moral obligations to break down barriers to entry within this system that we have currently in pharmaceutical companies. The policy that government has to stand behind today is one that continues to promulgate economic and health inequality. That's something they have to stand by today, and I will prove that within the rest of my speech. What has gone wrong, drastically wrong, so far in this debate, mostly on opening? There's been a vast mischaracterization of the pragmatic outcomes as well as the actors. Everything in this debate has primarily focused on those who are already terminally ill. Today we're going to bring up like the large majority of people that are affected by pharmaceutical companies, those that are not terminally ill and have different incentives. I'm also going to prove why government has like not proved at all why the people that are terminally ill have the incentives they do, but that's going to come a little later in my speech. So what do these kind of things within pharmacies, how do these interactions with pharmacies happen? So what happens is that under op, what we get is actually like a more narrow product base. Why is this the case inherently? When things are regulated to the point where it has to be effective, it just means like inherently it's going to be a smaller amount of products that are all effective. That's just like how it's going to work. What this means is that we don't have things like placebos being sold. It means we only have things that are effective. What does this mean? This means that there's not an existence of like low-cost placebos on the shelf. What do those low-cost placebos mean? When the average consumer is going to walk into a pharmacy, what they're going to see is this low sticker price. What does that mean? That means these people that are underrepresented and have economic barriers to entry for like more expensive drugs are going to look and say, hey, look, that's a cheap drug, and it says it's going to cure everything I want. I'm just going to buy that. What this means is that in the instance that it doesn't work, which oftentimes it probably won't, when it isn't effective when this person gets back home and a few weeks later, they're like gonna therefore go back and spend the money to like buy a new drug, therefore costing them more. Or in the other instance, nothing's going to help them, or they're just going to like continue to be sick. That's just the reality of what's going to happen. Now, under ours, what happens is that when you have drugs that are actually effective, what they do is like they buy it once, they realize it works, and they don't spend twice the money on an ineffective drug. That's just how these interactions are going to work out. And therefore, when this happens, we get like more people in the pharmacy instead of becoming disillusioned with like pharmacies in general. Now I'm going to get on some extraneous rebuttal from a bunch of the speeches. So, Opening Gov today talked about like hindering research and how it was time-oriented. Their entire case was like inherently contradictory. Why is this the case? They're skipping the step for effectiveness in this model, which means there's like more things available on the shelf. But why this is hypocritical in and of itself is that there are more options in the shelf that are just like bad, which means people are going to get a larger quantity of like bad things on the shelf. So like expediting the time factor isn't really going to help on that. So, and therefore the consumer just like doesn't have incentives to not choose like the best options because the price is going to be lower for like fake placebos under the status quo. Now let's get into like the free market. Hypocritically, Gov says that we should like wait for the free market to show what is bad, kind of like what Van brought up. This just like isn't the case. Now they talked a lot about like why doctors help people. One, this isn't always the case, just because like our most common actors, the people that are just like don't have the money to be able to spend on like the premium drug in the first place, don't always like have a doctor. They can just like show up to an office and do so. These barriers to entry exist like to have a doctor, to have an appointment. That's just going to be a thing that costs a lot of money. Not everyone's going to have that ability to have a doctor recommend drugs to them. And now like that people will do research, people just like don't do that. When a person's terminally ill, they're often just like not going to be able to have just like the ability to like do a bunch of research, spend a lot of time. They're probably going to be doing like a lot of things like if they have cancer, like chemo sessions. They're going to be spending a large part of their day in treatment with doctors if that's the case. To move on to like some rebuttal of what Charlotte said. So like she talked about the perverse incentives of pharmaceutical companies under us. But like we just still think like government regulations are going to like cover this. She says that like pharmaceuticals are just going to like skew, big pharmas are going to like skew, big pharma's going to skew things like their research opportunities, but just like, this just like isn't probably going to happen. And I'll explain more of that in my substantive. Again, so similar to like Van's POI, why they say they get doctors to care more just like doesn't always happen, because when doctors do, if they even did spend time to invest in their own research, which like in the first place they just like are quite busy people in the first place already, even if they do this, like he said, just like economically, the burdens are there just like therefore gonna fall onto the like consumer, and that's just because when the supply curve shifts, that means, when the demand curve shifts, that's going to affect the consumer more. And oftentimes doctors have like partnerships with like big pharma, and therefore you can't always trust like what the doctors say, and therefore it's like more problematic under the Gov. Now to like get onto some substantive material about like trust and accountability. So why does Gov today bolster a false trust in pharmaceutical companies? This is because it's far harder for like small breakout businesses to get groundbreaking research out, as they're because it's harder for them to like break those price barriers. Because under like when there's no regulation under Gov, what's going to happen is people are going to like get lower prices on their like placebo effects, which means no one's going to get out there and actually buy the products that like these breakout firms are making, which like are more often gonna like produce better quality drugs. Why is this the case? Because they like aren't gonna be able to have the things like larger production facilities to produce at a lower cost, so their only incentive is to produce a higher quality product that is actually effective. These people are stifled under Gov. So like why do people under the Gov gravitate towards these name brands? This is because like basic things of exposure like TV, radio, word of mouth that like big pharmaceutical companies just like have available to them on TV, which means that like when people go to the pharmacy, they're going to see the name brand, they're going to say, oh look, that's like a name I recognize, therefore more incentive to buy that, which again under the Gov, it's just like inherently more likely to not be effective, just under like the definition. So therefore, Gov has people funneled into Big Pharma who already have perverse incentives under Gov for monetary reasons to like make placebos. Therefore, like they have less people getting good drugs. Why do we win on the terms of economics? Because we have we have people paying like a commensurate price. 2, we have better safety outcomes because things are more effective. Thirdly, we have better time outcomes. Thank you.
What do you mean don't shit? That was a good speech. No. Well, sort of.
Yes.
Yeah, right? Is anybody not ready?
Go slow.
I'm gonna go slow. The previous speaker primarily engages in the fantasy world of opening government where like macaroons or whatever are being sold on the shelves and the onus is entirely on the consumer to do like as much in-depth research as they can and try to figure out what the best possible medication is for them. We paint you a much more accurate picture of what this world is going to look like, one where the onus is shifted primarily not onto the consumer, but onto doctors and onto healthcare organizations and institutions such as hospitals, universities, pharmacies. We think 2 things are true in the status quo. 1, there is an incentive for pharmaceutical companies to put forward drugs that don't necessarily work, but rather get people to keep buying them and create more and more profit for the drug company. An example of this is things like antidepressants, which clinical studies have shown in many cases don't actually do anything about depression, but still get the FDA seal of approval because Big Pharma is able to bribe them into getting them on the market, and then people feel worse when they get off the antidepressants and get stuck in a cycle where despite the ineffectiveness of the drug, they have absolutely no recourse and have to just keep buying prescription after prescription. Secondly, we think that because of these financial incentives that exist, and just like because of the way the status quo is and the number of medications we can see that do the opposite of what they're intended to do in the name of like getting people hooked on them, in the name of creating these cycles of prescription, what ends up happening is that the FDA and its comparable organizations in Canada and Europe are not effective institutions at actually checking whether or not the drugs are effective, which takes out all of their arguments about efficacy, which means what the FDA and similar organizations do functionally instead is just act as a sort of legal stopgap where you never have any sort of recourse against a drug not working because it got the government seal of approval, as though you're never going to win a case against anyone like the FDA. The result of this is that when a consumer is wronged by their drug in the status quo, what happens is they try to go up and find that they go to their doctor and they say, "Why did you prescribe me this drug that doesn't work?" And the doctor said, "It does work. The FDA says it does." What do? They either have to step down or try to take a lawsuit that is doomed to fail to the FDA. We think we change where the incentive chain operates because now that the onus is being placed on other organizations, we think that pharmacies and hospitals are going to have no choice but to be the ones who choose to do this research. Because now, if they get sued, if they get approached by a patient whose drug doesn't work, the patient is going to have to ask, where did this drug come from? And who approved this drug? And they're going to have to say, we did. Or they're going to have to say that the local hospital did, or the Mayo Clinic did. And now there is a prime target which can actually be financially victimized in a serious way because we know there are massive financial consequences to medical malpractice lawsuits that things like government seals of approval are able to check back against. I'll take one of you.
Okay, in Europe and Canada first, the hospitals are heavily subsidized by the government. 80-90% are subsidized. How is it different from the FDA of these countries to do the research instead of the hospital? Secondly, doctors are...
I will only take one question. To answer your question, however, our argument is not about whether or not the government is getting checks from the FDA. Our argument is that now the government getting checks from the FDA doesn't mean anything because when these cases go to court, you no longer have any sort of recourse in that regard. You no longer have that sort of, you no longer have the defense of, the government has already approved it and signed off on it, which means even if the government is still financially invested in the healthcare system, and even if some perverse financial incentives exist in the healthcare on both sides of the house, we think we check back against the ones that make it impossible for people to pursue any meaningful action against these drugs that are ineffectual. The result of this is that now hospitals and doctors have major legal consequences that they can face when the drugs don't work. These massive financial incentives means, contrary to what Jackson said, the onus is going to be on the doctors. There's going to be a focus on, for example, medical schools are probably going to shift to making clinical doctors also have to do more research and be more research-oriented, because all of the blame now lies on the doctor, and all of the negative financial incentives now lie on them, which means when you, as a pharmaceutical company, try to put these bogus drugs to market to benefit your financial incentives, the hospitals are now going to say, no way, because we don't have any sort of government seal of approval. We're the ones who have to check this, and if it ends up not working, if your shitty drug just gets people addicted and hooked and making prescriptions over and over and over again, then yeah, maybe you'll get more money, but we're going to lose tons and tons of money the second any consumer recognizes what's going on. Yes?
The cost of the financial L that hospitals take in a malpractice lawsuit goes on the consumers, and this new research would also the cost of it go on the consumers. How do you prevent your entire financial burden from going on the consumers?
I think that arguing that the cost of malpractice lawsuits goes on the consumers is like a roundabout way of saying that we shouldn't have people's healthcare go up in the short term or have more taxes be paid, for example, in exchange for people actually having medications that work and result in them not dying and result in them not having to do things like go to emergency rooms in the first place, which in the long term saves way, way more money and prevents the things you talk about, like cycles of people having to try out drugs over and over again and not being able to effectively discriminate between them. We don't argue that there's not going to be divisions between, for example, the drugs that wealthy and poor people can operate on both sides of the house. We can't completely get rid of those socioeconomic differences, but what we can get rid of is a world in which the drugs that are marketed to poor people, the mass-marketed drugs, simply don't work, and in which the first drug you see on the shelf, the drug that is spread most by word of mouth or on advertisement, is actually just a placebo that only works because hospitals are pushing it and know that if it doesn't work, they will have to suffer absolutely zero negative consequences for it. This creates a very positive incentive structure for the consumer because it means that, no, they don't have to individually do their research on every single drug. But what they do have to do, but what the hospitals and pharmacies now have to do is recognize that they are culpable for what happens to the consumers, and there are meaningful implications of that, even outside of things like getting sued or experiencing damage in the courts. If a patient comes to you and says, why doesn't my drug work? And you say, the FDA approved it, they'll just say, oh, sorry, it couldn't have been your fault. Versus when you say, my hospital approved it, they'll say, I'm going to find another doctor. This means doctors have, all the incentive structures point to doctors now have an incentive to do efficacy tests that are actually on net effective, and means that all of the drugs we get are more effective, right? The comparative is not macaroons being sold versus FDA-approved drugs being sold. The comparative is a world in which drugs that get paid off so that they can get through the FDA process get put to shelves, versus drugs that actually work get put to shelves. Whether this results in more or fewer drugs, we don't know, but we think it results in a greater diversity of the companies those drugs are coming from and cuts back against Big Pharma's monopoly and ability to have complete and total control over the market, and instead creates a market in which people have drugs that work, a multiplicity of options on the shelf that at least work. It's not a case of something like the EpiPen being a government monopoly, it's a case of even if there is a government monopoly drug, it has to work or there are consequences for it not working. Ultimately, what we do is make people who prescribe drugs culpable for their actions, and means they have to care more and engage in forms of research that are genuine and not informed by negative external actors, thus resulting in medications that don't work, but say they do and use appeals to authority to convince gullible people into thinking they have no positive recourse, which we prove they do. Proud to propose.
Yeah, I have clothes in the laundry.
Oh,
I really.
One more show, it's okay.
Bye, Jackson. Thank you. See you tomorrow.
That was so cute. Hey. Right. Honorable panel. So as the last person speaking, I want to first go over some major themes within this motion. First, we must consider the role of the government. While opening government has proposed that we should allow for a free government, we must realize that some of the essential roles of a government is to correct for undesirable market results. And because of a free market and living in a capitalist society, some undesirable results, like emphasized by Jackson, are health and wealth inequalities. Also, the role of the government should also be to promote and ensure transparency and accountability, and making sure that just overall the market is functioning fairly, which we could not be successfully doing if this policy is implemented. Why? Because first, let's consider the results of if this motion is implemented. Well, like Jackson talked about, people are going to be, it's actually counterintuitive because people are going to be wasting more time and more money. How? Because one, people will be seeking out the cheapest options they see on the shelves or something, which because with more options, people understanding that there's a paradox of choice, people would be like wasting more time just testing trial and errors themselves and be expected to conduct research for their own. So because people are seeking out the cheapest options and not understanding that they actually just aren't effective, people will be wasting time and just be wasting more of their own money. And also, what now? The opening government and like closing government has been emphasizing quantity over quality. So this is which will get into my second theme. They think that it's better to have more options and not consider whether just have more options that are it's better to have more options that are ineffective than it is to have less options that are effective. And with this, having consumers to seek out more options that are ineffective will again lead to them wasting more money and more time, which is counterintuitive, like mentioned by Jackson. And also with wasting time and being with these consumers and patients being so exhausted from wasting time and money, this will lead to detrimental effects such as psychological ones. One, like Jackson mentioned, it will interfere between the trust with the consumer, between the consumer and companies, and with the consumer and doctors, because people are only seeking out because when we're not testing for a baseline of effectiveness, people will resort to companies that have better reputation, like Jackson mentioned. But knowing that this can be easily taken advantage of because companies knowing that they are going to be the ones that they trust, they can easily raise their prices, and then which will ruin the relationship between the consumer and the company. And also now that because doctors will be the ones that are of course prescribing these medications because when they are ineffective, they will be the ones who the consumers are blaming even more. So that will ruin the relationship between companies and the individual and the doctors and the consumer. And also because people will be so exhausted from constantly seeking out things for themselves because they have to do trial and error on themselves. They have to seek out, there are too many options to pick from, and also they have to be the ones to conduct their own research. People would be very hopeless and just tired. And in this case, with hopelessness, people just might not even want to seek out any medications at all, knowing that they're not going to be effective in the first place. And what this will result in is actually just perpetuating a cycle where more people are sick because they're just not motivated, and they don't trust the system anymore. So yeah, they won't trust the system anymore because no one is regulating the system, and that's why we should have the government coming in, because the role is to regulate the system, and without them, it just leads to a broken system without trust, and it's also without trust. Also, it is a moral obligation, like mentioned by Jackson, not by opening opposition. Is that if we know that a medication is not. If we know that some sort of this medication is not effective in the first place, then why would anybody want to seek it? Because the main purpose of treatment is for it to be effective, for it to resolve a current condition, a current problem. But when that basis, that foundation is no longer there, then when that foundation is no longer there, it's just it leads to a broken system, and so it should be just a basic moral obligation to ensure the most basic purpose of medication is to treat diseases, conditions, and all these for it to be there. And if we take away the step where we test for effectiveness, that basic foundation is going to be taken away as well. So in conclusion, this whole motion is counterintuitive because it undermines the role of the government, and for not being, because they should be the one correcting for undesirable market results, and be the one regulating for the effectiveness of these medications. And as a result, what happens is that it ruins the relationship between consumers and whether it be companies or doctors, and leaves like deep psychological effects that results in a broken system. And this broken system will actually be a step backwards, because if implemented with a broken system, people will have to spend more money and more time into fixing it. And with that, we are proud to oppose.
All right. Yay, good job, everybody.
Oh, people didn't say their names.
Oh, it's okay.
We got it.